to share their thoughts and recording in progress. They'll be sharing their thoughts and insights onto this topic. So first, just a few housekeeping points for today. My name is Beth Rebisz and I'm a committee member of MBC and I'll be chairing today's session. If you would like to participate in the Q&A part of the session, please do add your comments or your questions in the chat. Feel free to add them to the chat at any stage of the conversation and I'll field these for speakers. If they're directed to a specific speaker, please do make that clear. We'll also use the raise your hand function during the Q&A and I'll try and chair all of those. Please bear with me if I miss anyone. Please just highlight in the chat that I've missed you. I won't have done it on purpose. So if everyone else could ensure that their microphones are turned off, speakers, please feel free to keep your microphones on so we can hear your wonderful insights. Please all feel encouraged to tweet or post on social media about the event. You can find MBC's account at Museum of BC. Now, before I fully introduce our speakers for today, I wanted to offer a little insight into why we're holding today's event. So at the Museum of British Colonialism, we explore how British ideas of detention have been repurposed, reused and maintained in different parts of the world. So we've been asking questions about how have the physical, legal and social infrastructure of detention been rooted in British and European ideas of anti-Blackness. And we're thinking about how this manifests in the criminal systems in existence today. So MBC has been working as a team since 2018 to document, creatively communicate and preserve these histories, mainly so far in relation to the history of Kenya's fight against its former colonial occupiers, Britain, during the 1950s. Now, within this work, we've been conducting field research, oral history interviews, building digital reconstructions of sites of detention in partnership with African Digital Heritage. And we've been hosting a range of events and exhibitions which really showcase these often buried and marginalised narratives of colonialism. Now, our newest project really broadens this as we embark on documenting the physical remnants of one particular detention camp that Britain built during the Mau Mau insurgency era in Kenya, called Manyani. So we're interested to see what happened to these colonial sites of detention after independence. So for today's event, we've called upon our wider network of experts and commentators to discuss some of the wider questions driving this project. So enough from me. I'm going to introduce our speakers and then open the floor for discussion. So firstly, we're joined by Kristen Peterson, an attorney and criminal justice and human rights researcher at the Dula Omar Institute for Constitutional Law, Governance and Human Rights at the University of the Western Cape, South Africa. So Kristen has been working in the human rights and criminal justice sector since 2012, with stints at the South African Human Rights Commission and the Judicial Inspectorate for Prisons, where she was responsible for overseeing and monitoring the conditions and treatments of inmates. She's actively involved in the Detention Justice Forum, seeking to ensure that the rights and well-being of those who are detained are respected, as enshrined under the South African Constitution, laws and international human rights norms and standards. So her organisation is actively involved in the global campaign to decriminalise poverty and status. Secondly, we have Katherine Bruce-Lockhart, an assistant professor in history at the University of Waterloo and a faculty member at the Bristol School of International Affairs. Katherine's research critically examines the afterlives of colonial carceral institutions, drawing connections to movements for decolonisation and prison abolition. Her recent book, which is fabulous, if you haven't yet read it, Carceral Afterlives, Prisons, Detention and Punishment in Post-Colonial Uganda, brings together social history, political history and critical prison studies to analyse how prisons and other carceral spaces persisted in Uganda after independence and offering critique on their ongoing existence. And her previous research, which is how we both met, looked at the detention camp system created by the British in the 1950s, specifically focusing on the detention of Kenyan women. And last but by no means least, we're really excited to welcome Patrick Gathara today. Patrick is a Kenyan journalist and award-winning political cartoonist and author. He's regularly published commentary on regional and international affairs, a recent one, which I particularly enjoyed, being titled The Coronation of King Charles, a Fresh Layer of Royal Whitewash for Al Jazeera. Fantastic piece. Having served 2 stints as curator-in-chief at the Elephant, Patrick has recently taken up a new role as senior editor for inclusive reporting at the New Humanitarians. So thank you all so much for taking the time to speak with us today. Let's dive straight into discussion then. And I wondered if I could start actually with you, Patrick, thinking about the sort of contemporary relevance of our discussion. As a political commentator in Nairobi, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the significance and the presence of the prison system, justice system in Kenya today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I think speaking about the prison system in Kenya, it's good to sort of contextualize it from where it came. I mean, obviously, as many of you will know,
Oh, we've just lost you there, I think, Patrick. I don't know whether that's just me or...
I think Patrick is frozen.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh no.
Oh,
can you guys hear me?
We've got you back now, Patrick. Sorry, you froze.
Oh, right.
You started.
Wow, I had really like gone off on some. I hope I can remember half of what I said. But anyway, yeah. So there were no prisons in Kenya prior to colonialism, and systems of justice were really pretty much victim-centered, were more about recompense than sort of retribution for towards the offenders. They were more focused on repairing, if you will, the rift that's caused within society by crime. But when the British came, prisons were one of the first things they brought. So they sort of introduced this idea of incarceration, of carceral in punitive incarceration. So which wasn't here. And so they started locking up people. And I think within the first 15 years, they built something like 30 or so prisons. You know, by 1931, I believe they built somewhere around double that. You know, so they were pretty much building about 2 prisons a year. You know, and there were, I mean, they were incarcerating huge numbers of people, and this is even before the Mau Mau conflict. And so I think for a lot of people, prisons became these places of both abandonment and also sort of places of punishment and of dejection, of rejection by society. And until today, I mean, pretty much somebody goes into prison is disappeared. And I think when you look at it in a contemporary sense, we've got to remember we haven't been building prisons in Kenya. Lots of our prisons are still the same ones the British built, you know, to a large extent. They're just staffed with many more people. I mean, filled with many more people, not really staffed. And many of even the procedures and processes that happen in prisons are very reminiscent of what was going on during colonialism, and especially during the whole Mau Mau period. I remember reading once about the procedures of counting prisoners. It's sort of like this never-ending counting system that they have, where people are grouped in groups of 5, forced to sort of squat on their hinges and then are counted. And it's more like 2, 3 times a day that this happens, several times a day and even at night. And that's exactly what they were doing during the Mau Mau thing. So people basically learned that and re-exported it. So I think prisons for me stand out as a continuation of sort of the colonial logic, both of punishment, you know, but also the colonial logic of control. They were a system of control, of ensuring that people were obedient, if you will, to the authorities, and that's how prisons essentially till today have been presented. They're not really in Kenya, even in Kenyan discourse, are presented as places of rehabilitation. A lot of it is about punishment, and it's about scaring people into doing things that the government wants it to do. One final point I'll make is that lots of the people within our prisons today are not actually convicted of any crime. And incarceration has been spread. The idea of jailing people, of arrest in itself as the punishment, not something that happens, or detention as something that happens after you've been convicted, is the idea of arrest itself that has now become something that really scares people. And so for any slight infraction, a traffic infraction, you can find yourself thrown into jail, pending, and a lot of it happens like on Fridays when everybody is waiting for the weekend. Lots of arrests happen on Fridays. People spend the night on Friday and then are mysteriously released, during the weekend after obviously paying some money. So it's also a system of extortion and really encourages this sort of corrupt judicial process system that Kenya is saddled with today. I hope that sort of kind of answers the question.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Patrick. There's so much to unpack there, especially this continuation of colonial logics of control and these not being sites of rehabilitation, but these being sites of punishment and punitive action. And I wondered then, Kate, if I could bring you in here to sort of really unpack some of those historical roots in this system based on your research with Kenya and Uganda, because this idea of rehabilitation, especially in Kenya, has a very specific context, but it does in all sort of histories of punishment, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much for having us today. And Patrick, thanks for getting us started. I actually assign one of your articles in The Elephant about the settler roots of Kenya's prison system to my students, and they really get a lot out of it. So it's really nice to hear you speak about these themes as well. And yeah, I'll kind of echo a lot of what Patrick has said and think about it in relation to Kenya and Uganda, but also more broadly across British colonies on the African continent. So as Patrick mentioned, prisons were virtually unknown on the African continent prior to colonial rule. There are some exceptions to this, but they were really something that was forcibly imposed by the British or the French or the Portuguese or the Belgians. And the introduction of prisons, also policing, new types of court systems, was really justified by Europeans as part of this racist civilizing mission. So it was this idea that prisons were seen to be more humane than the wide range of justice practices that were used by African communities, which isn't the case. But this was the logic that was sort of underpinning it, this logic of white supremacy and this logic of anti-Blackness. And that shaped sort of who was seen as deviant, who was seen as criminal, and how people were punished, right? So again, Patrick's alluded to this, but why did Europeans use prisons? Not to rehabilitate people, right? And that's something, an idea that we've seen kind of underlying the introduction of prisons around the world, but not really happening in practice, which is why we see a lot of movements for abolition today, for example. So why did the British use prisons in Kenya or Uganda or elsewhere, for example? It was a way to establish and consolidate colonial control, and also, as Patrick said, part of economic exploitation, right? Which was, of course, a key pillar of colonialism. And not only could they imprison people who were resisting colonial control or who were fighting for independence, but also for lots of short-term offenses. Patrick said traffic ordinance violations. A lot of people, the majority of prisoners in Uganda, for example, were there for tax defaulting, right? For refusing to pay taxes or for not being able to pay taxes. So serving these really short-term offenses where even if there had been a goal of rehabilitation, it couldn't have been carried out in practice when people are just going in and out of the system frequently. And of course, prisons were also a source of forced labor. And we see this in detention camps in places like Kenya, but we also see this a lot earlier. So preventative detention in Kenya was used as early as, I think, 1926. And we see people working on farms, prisoners being forced to work on farms, in industries, and generating revenue for the state, right? So when we think about the goals of colonial incarceration, it's to impose control, to maintain control, and to economically exploit people. And that doesn't necessarily just go away right after independence. So I think that's what I'll add for now. Thanks, Beth.
Thank you.
Beth, can I say something?
Yeah, please.
Just very quickly to add to that. It wasn't just exploitation for the state. I mean, at least as far as Kenya is concerned, there's been documented cases where if colonial employers felt their employees weren't being productive enough, they could actually get them in prison, as punishment. And then when they're released, then hopefully the productivity goes up, they're scared into working harder. So it's not just the state that was benefiting from this, but it was the entire edifice of colonialism that was.
Yeah. Thank you both. And thinking about that economic exploitation, I think is really important. And then also branching out from that is that how this is being policed, how people are actually ending up in prison. Kristen, I really wanted to bring you in here with your experience with South Africa. Do you see similarities here with your expertise, and especially thinking about the sort of policing practices and petty offences and how they're sort of treated within the criminal justice system?
Yeah, sure, Beth. Everything that has been said here, I mean, it's basically we can replicate within the South African context. This idea of prisons being, it was a penal ideology which we call racially differentiated punishment back then. But if I may look at some of the research that we've done in the Southern African area, there are so many oppressive laws used by the colonial powers, such as the UK, France, and Belgium, that are still being enforced amongst the population today. And we've documented this extensively in our report called Punished for Being Poor. And these laws were designed to enforce white colonial control. And a lot of that social control legislation still exists in today's society. And this was basically fundamentally what the global campaign on the decriminalization of poverty and status is all about. And some of these offenses that we're looking at are nuisance-related offences, loitering, the offences called being a rogue and a vagabond. There are insult laws that are still exist in Zambia, for example. And then if you look at South Africa, for instance, many of these laws have been repurposed and made to look as if, it's it complies with our constitution, and it is equal, and it doesn't promote any injustice, but it's still there. It still controls certain types of people, predominantly poor and marginalized people. And if you look at the way it works, like we've in Africa generally inherited a policing model which was established by colonial powers, and that unfortunately still remain intact. And I think it was Patrick that mentioned at the beginning, we're looking at, there was an emphasis on higher arrest rates, and particularly for these types of offenses. And the reason why we have these types of offenses is because the colonial powers wanted to keep a certain population outside of these cities. They wanted to control the economic power. They wanted that for themselves. And a lot of these offenses, officials can actually arrest people without actually having a warrant of arrest. So that allows law enforcement officials unfettered discretion to, target people based on the way they look, they walk, and so forth. And we have to bear in mind that back then policing was not during the colonial times. It wasn't based on general public safety. There was very little investigative capacity. all purposeful policing. And the style of policing was very paramilitary in character, and it served a narrow interest group with political and commercial concerns, as I've noticed. And this has still today resulted in many problems, arbitrary arrest for minor offences and detention. And that in itself leads to many other challenges that persist in indirectly in our criminal justice systems. So I can continue to talk about that maybe as the conversation flows.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And yeah, thinking about this sort of colonial policing model, Patrick, do we see this sort of in today's society in Kenya?
Yeah, I mean, again, also, I mean, obviously, our police came with the British. The funny thing is, I think if you look at what Kristen is saying, and Catherine as well, there are similarities across the board in how these things were implemented, and there was an actual model, that they were following, and lots of this is stuff that was developed, through a pipeline, that starts with Ireland, and you've got officials moving from there, moving to places like Palestine, Malaysia, before they end up, in Africa, and they're being sort of indoctrinated, inculcated, and trained in how to view people and how to deal with people. So I think there is an actual model. In Kenya, it's really never been comprehensively reformed. So whether we're talking about policing or about the prison system, and they kind of go together, they're basically the same sides of the same, two sides of the same coin. Our police exist essentially, and they were described as this in an official report that was done, that they were essentially a citizen containment squad, and that's what they have been till today. They exist to protect the people in power from those they rule over. So to protect the government officials and a small elite from the rest of the people from whom they are essentially stealing, which was essentially their role under colonialism. They weren't set up to, make life better for Patrick. They were here to protect the whole scheme of extraction. And I think till today, that's essentially what they do, and how they are, in fact, rewarded. If you look at how our police, for example, why they are paid so badly, given that they are such an essential part of protecting this mechanism of extraction. The real compensation comes in being afforded opportunities of extraction themselves, which is why then corruption keeps growing within police, because that's essentially how they are paid, by being allowed to participate. And if you look at how the colonial system was set up, it's the same way they co-opted our local collaborators, so like the chiefs they appointed would essentially be tasked with collecting tax, and they'd be told, give us so much, the rest is yours. And they all became overnight the wealthiest people on the land. Anybody would, given that. So our police serve pretty much the same functions, today, and they continue basically safeguarding and upholding that system because they've got an incentive to do it.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And thank you, Anthony, for your comment in the chat about thinking about home guards and prison wardens who took over from the colonial legacy to become administrators after independence. Kate, maybe if I could come to you in thinking about who are these sort of individuals that are involved in creating these colonial systems of detention and punitive punishment, and who does this transition to into independence, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Beth. And Before I answer that question, if it's okay, I just wanted to build on to some of the great points that Kristen and Patrick brought up, just in terms of thinking about these legacies, right? These afterlives of colonial punishment in terms of preventative detention and detention without trial, and also the militarization of the police, right? So just briefly, and I'm happy to expand more on this later. So for example, in Uganda, but also many other places like Kenya, when the police are first set up, it's actually the police, the prison, and the military are all tied into one system. So people could work for the police, they could work for the prisons, they could work for the military. There wasn't necessarily specialized prison training or police training. It was all militarized. And in Uganda, the prison system didn't actually become a separate system until 1936, right? Which is a long time. And that entanglement, even though the sort of police and prisons and military are divided later on, that entanglement never really goes away. And we see the repeated use of the military in situations, for example, where the state is declaring a state of emergency. Obviously, we see this in Kenya, but we also see this in lots of other places. And, you know, bringing in the King's African Rifles, for example, but after independence, bringing in special forces anytime there's a perceived sort of threat to state order. And we see these preventative detention policies as well, right? So different types of policies. So like the habitual offenders ordinance or the habitual criminals ordinance that comes in. So as Kristen was saying, people who get arrested for these really minor offenses again and again are then perceived as habitual offenders and can be put into camps and just stay there, and they're being punished again for really minor sort of economic infractions. But then we also have legislation around preventative detention. So for example, in Uganda, there was something known as the Public Order and Security Act that was passed after independence. And it drew directly, you know, as Kristen was saying before, drew directly from colonial policies around deportation, but was just repackaged in a new way. And anyone who was seen as threatening the political stability, again, perceived as being a political opponent, could be detained without trial indefinitely. So I think those, in terms of legislation and policies, those are really key. And if we think about this entanglement of the police, the prisons, the military, that helps us to see sort of who is actually on the ground running these institutions day to day. And then after independence, there is still a lot of that entanglement, a lot of those connections. And the majority of people who took over the prison system, for example, in Uganda after independence, had been trained by the British, right? Had been trained under the colonial system. And although some were critical of it, a lot of people felt that these traditions of sort of militarism and masculinity in many cases were sort of traditions that should be upheld. And we're really proud of that training. And as Patrick said, there's so many continuities from the physical buildings themselves, right? It's the same prisons, Kamiti prison in Kenya, Luzira prison in Uganda, but also the same uniforms. And when I would interview prison staff, they would also often talk about the uniforms, which even those haven't necessarily changed, right? So there's this strong kind of nostalgia and heritage around the colonial origins of the prison service or the police. Now, does everyone share this? No, but it's still there in a lot of ways. So I hope that helps to answer the question.
Just trying to find my unmute button. Yeah, I think that's really interesting, that sort of nostalgia and heritage of prison, that framing of it. It makes me think a lot about the sort of research we've been doing at NBC in terms of sites, how they've been repurposed in Kenya today. So not only just as new prisons and staying within a prison system, but now also being repurposed and used as schools. So sites whereby students and children are being educated in the schooling system, and they would form a sites of detention and horrific levels of violence and torture. And so even the heritage around those spaces is a really interesting one, especially in Kenya, but I think that cross borders.
Even sort of the logic, if you can think of how schools are run, in essence, as prisons. If you think of our boarding schools in Kenya where kids are locked in, At night they can go out. It's a very regimented existence within schools. It really mirrors to a large extent our life inside of a prison. It's this sort of regimenting of society. I think Katherine sort of alluded to this in terms of how of this sort of civilizing idea being that the regimentation of society, that you've got to follow particular rules, you've got to be a particular way, I think is then fed up through the school system. One of the questions for me that's been really interesting has been to ask, why wasn't there much, at least in Kenya's case, much activism around getting rid of prisons? You don't hear prisons being centers of resistance, people going and trying to demolish them, or anything. If anything, they become adopted, and after independence, incarceration becomes accepted as this, sort of as this really good way to deal with criminals. And today, and I know we'll get into the discussion of abolition later, when you speak to guys, they find it very difficult to imagine, a society where incarceration is not the way you deal with crime. Anyway,
I'm very much the same here in the UK. Absolutely, absolutely. No, and thank you. You're nudging us in the right direction there, Patrick, in terms of thinking about abolition. Before we go deeper into that conversation, I wondered, Kristen, could you speak a little bit about conditions within prisons and the sort of work? I guess I'm wondering about the practitioner element and what's happening today in terms of efforts to improve conditions, efforts to regulate conditions within prisons, and what some of the historical roots of that may be, I guess.
Yeah, sure. So we had, the British colonized us, and then we had apartheid, and that was also South Africa was once again still subjected to racial segregation and inferior education. Our prison systems were still subjected to centers for punishment. There was no rehabilitative notions to that. And then comes the democracy, and the new government tries to put laws in place and tries to change things and the way detention centers are seen. And there's a movement towards a more notion of rehabilitation and education, and all the constitution is there, and protection of rights and liberties. Especially since a lot of the political activists, were detained in conditions of detention that were not good for human dignity, and so therefore the constitution was drafted, but especially based on the concept of prisons and the deprivation of liberty, making it more human for people to live in. And so South Africa really has a good normative framework in terms of the protection of people, and specifically the constitution makes it clear, conditions of detention must be consistent for human dignity, and provides accused persons and arrested and detained persons specific rights, with access to legal representation and so forth and so on. And there's also a protective element organization that was set up, named as the Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services, to ensure that the Department of Corrections are overseen, and that they are ensuring that inmates are kept in detention facilities that are humane. Unfortunately, even though those norms are there and the standards are there, it obviously has significantly changed from how it was in the past. But there are still some of those conditions of detention that we are still struggling with. We do still see an emphasis on punishment, unfortunately. And then there's also the heightened call still to confine people for longer terms through the minimum sentences regime that we're trying to introduce, which, politicians are always using that to, when they bugger up and they aren't able to provide the socioeconomic incentives to deal with certain criminal behavior. And so, unfortunately, our remand detention centers are, our prison population, a third of that prison population is on remand detention. And so that's where you see huge problems with the criminal justice system, with people being arrested and detained. And that investigations are either still ongoing through the prosecutorial system without fully investigating a case. People are detained for that particular crime, but then also it takes longer to prosecute individuals. And that's why you see them in detention for periods even up to 5 years, averaging about 2 years if they are not granted bail. But you also see some of those legacies of the past, which result in anti-Blackness, one would say. That is, for example, the system of bail. That's one example where if you if you're applying for bail, you need to prove, obviously, that you have a residential address. And so therefore a police official need to verify that you live somewhere. And if you look at the way people live in South Africa, a lot of them don't have fixed addresses. So that's just one of some of the minor issues that we still struggle with. But then there's also the affordability of bail. And there's this whole conversation about repurposing what bail is there for. And if we should look at other ways in which we can secure an accused attendance in courts. So dismal conditions of detention, unfortunately, because detention centers were built as punishment centers, we unfortunately sit with a situation where the infrastructure was not designed for rehabilitation. And so even if we have the notion that if you're going to jail, we want to rehabilitate you, it's very difficult, despite all the norms and the standards and the personnel that you get in there, to render rehabilitation programs to ensure that people are actually rehabilitated and reintegrated in society. And then you do, obviously, generally the socio-economic circumstances of many of people in detention facilities. Many of them are very poor. And so it's very difficult, even if they do come out, for them to, stay out of that criminality. So those are just some of the general issues, conditions. Some prisons are better than others. And that's just unfortunately how it is. And there's always talk about building more prisons, but that's not going to solve the problem. Fortunately for us, we do have an inspectorate that's able to report quarterly, monthly, annually on the conditions and try to improve that. But there are also some challenges within the system in that it's not fully independent to be able to do its job as well.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And I think from what all three of you are saying today, this is an infrastructure, as you say, that was never established for rehabilitation. And so we hear this discourse of rehabilitation, and we hear that not just now, we hear that from the colonial era, but it was never really a system designed for rehabilitation in any sense of the word. And these are all the sort of long-standing implications of that. So I guess, to not be too controversial, but bring up the big A word, let's have a little discussion about the abolition discourse, I guess. If these systems have never been designed in that way for rehabilitation, have abolition movements been a manifestation of contemporary protest and thought, or is there a longer history to abolition movements here as well? And that's kind of an open question to everyone. This is where it can become chaotic. So please dive in.
Well, I think since I'd already kind of started, I can just jump in here. I think that for me has been kind of like a real puzzle, why in Kenya there is not just an absence of real serious and sustained discussion on abolition, but actually sort of active resistance to it, and also when you go back to the colonial times, if you read what was there, where prisons were seen as these places of basically banishment, if you will, very quickly they became accepted, by people. And you don't have guys sort of going in and breaking people out of prison, and stuff. And I think that the way to understand it is to see prison as part of an entire logic of reforming society, so that colonialism changed not just a few aspects of how people understood themselves, but it was a whole thing, and it becomes impossible for people to think of life outside of certain frameworks. So we'll be told the thing to do with prisons is really to improve them, not to get rid of them, because they are in essence a good thing that is being done badly. That's how essentially the discourse here is carried on. So it's about, there's lots of talk about reform, about sort of the rehabilitation role that prisons can play, as if that is actually possible. I think there's also really very little understand or recall, if you will, of what was happening at the time when prisons were being built here in during colonialism. I mean, you had the whole reform movement in the West about reforming the prison system, about improving it there, about safeguarding, trying to safeguard particular rights. But where has it gone? I mean, prisons are still pretty bad places to be in wherever you are. And we are acting like we want to basically reinvent that history, to go through it ourselves, So I think until people are able to distance themselves from the system that was imposed, or to think outside of the parameters that were there, it's going to be very hard to get a real sustained discourse about eliminating prisons going. One final point that I make is, it's funny in Kenya that right now, I mean, just recently we had the widow of Dedan Kimathi passing away, and again the whole talk of let's find Dedan Kimathi's body, and give him an honorable burial. Let's go to committee and dig it up. But nobody talks of let's go and get rid of committee where he was killed. That's never part of the discourse. So I think we need to really change how we see the system that was put in, and to be able to banish it, not just sort of physically, but actually the mental supports, the ways of thinking that we've been inculcated in, that then make prisons basically inevitable.
Yeah, and at the heart of that, as you say, Patrick, colonialism is by design there to pervade every aspect of social, political, economic, legal frameworks within that so-called territories, for want of a better word. And so actually going to all those sort of debates about decolonization and what decolonization actually looks like in terms of, can you decolonize a system built on colonialism? What does that look like? Katherine, Kristen, would either of you like to come in on building these points around abolition?
I can jump in for a moment, Kristen, if that's okay with you. And then I'd love to hear what you have to say. Yeah, I think this is such an important point. I think it's so good to be having this discussion. And as Patrick said, from the very beginning of prisons being introduced, not just on the African continent, but just being introduced. I mean, prisons are a relatively new phenomenon in human history. Prisons were introduced in the late 18th, early 19th century in the way that we know them today. And I think either Patrick or Kristen was saying this as, the primary site of punishment rather than a precursor to another type of punishment. That idea is, 200, 250 years old. And I think just sort of reflecting on that and recognizing that is really important, because it reminds us that we haven't always had prisons. They're not an inevitable, natural part of society. And just reflecting on that helps us to think about the possibilities of how the future might look different, right? We had other justice systems in the past. We had other ways. And if we think about, Kenya or Uganda or other places, prisons have only been there since the sort of the very end of the 19th century, right? And I think that that can be important. And, I'll be very honest, I'm an abolitionist. I wasn't necessarily thinking in that way when I started doing this work, but I've seen hundreds of years worth of promises of reform. And the more you look at the origins of this system, and as we've all talked about today, we see these like deeply rooted problems that are really difficult to solve with reforms. And as Kristen said, reforms have often been proposed as let's build more prisons, right? There's obviously other reforms that are more effective, right. But I've been doing some work recently on looking at in the 1950s, so in the lead up to independence in Uganda, there were a series of protests led by prisoners. And the prisons were also severely overcrowded, something that has been a problem for a very long time. And the solution was not, oh, let's stop putting people in prison for these minor offenses. It was, let's just build more prisons. And actually, during that time, Patrick, as you were saying, you don't often see attacks on prisons, but people are actually attacking prisons and trying to free prisoners. And we see that right after independence too, which is really, really interesting. And still learning about this, but it's really interesting. And the only other thing I'll share, because this is something that I came across recently that really surprised me in my research. And, there is this long history of abolitionist struggle. Angela Davis, who's done so much great work on this topic, says, as long as there's been prisons, there's been abolition, but it's not always visible, right? Purposely so, the state doesn't want it to be visible. And there's a lot of risks, right, to calling out a prison system, a policing system. There's a lot of individual personal risk that comes with that. But I was recently reading some UN reports from the 1970s, and there was this meeting of government officials, prison staff, judicial officials, people who had a stake in the prison system in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia in 1978. And they were meeting, it was called something like the Regional Preparatory Meeting of African Experts. And they were discussing sort of the state of prison systems on the continent, and they were preparing for a UN meeting that was coming up on, the prevention of crime and treatment of offenders. And I knew we were going to talk about abolition, so I wrote this quote down because this was really interesting to me, especially given who these people were. Some of them were prison staff. And they said, and I'll just read the quote for a second, inhumane prisons were perhaps the last vestige of suppression imported by colonial powers, and Africa has to free itself from this vestige. The entire range of human imagination had to be mustered in the search for alternatives to imprisonment. So this is in the 1970s, and you have these prison officials, and government officials saying, prisons are a colonial institution and we need to get rid of them and find alternatives. That was really exciting to see, right? And has that translated into a mass abolitionist movement? No, but as you said, Beth, we haven't seen that really in the UK or in Canada where I live or in the US. It's building and it's really exciting to see that, but these systems are very entrenched and it can be hard to imagine alternatives, right? So, but I think there is that history there. It's just, learning about it and drawing inspiration from it to inform struggles moving forward, I think. So yeah, that's all I have to say for now. Thanks.
Thank you. And I think I'm so glad you said that as well about reflecting on the fact that prisons are only like 200 years old. These are very modern concepts. These aren't natural parts of our sort of our beings and the societies we live in. Kristen, did you want to come in on this question at all?
Wow, it's such a difficult question. I know in South Africa, it's not the idea of abolition is definitely not on the mind of a lot of people. I know in the US, there's quite a huge movement towards that. And they're definitely trying to get the South African counterparts on that particular campaign. So there does not seem to have been much resistance to the idea of incarcerating people or the notion of having prisons or the notion of prison abolition. In terms of decolonization, one of the issues that we do see it within the area of policing and arbitrary arrest. And I think when we look at that, and if we can change the way policing and how arrest happens, and changing the mindset of people to understand that confinement should actually be absolutely for the last resort, I think that's where we could make a change, and definitely the need to look towards alternatives to arrest and detention should be the fundamental criteria towards the move towards abolition. And I think the way it was just said is actually sounds very convincing, that could be the move towards that. And maybe that's something that our organization could also be looking at within that particular context. So yeah, in South Africa, for instance, there's still the idea that, we need to imprison people for longer. We need to repurpose the law to create more control, There's still,
Right.
the notion of, for these types of crimes, we should have minimum sentences. It's a populist approach. And the public and the people, they believe in incarceration and punishment. And it's all about also the decolonization of the minds of people, because at the end of the day, those are the voters that would put the people in power.
Yeah, I think one of the things I would ask, given what Catherine had said, is whether there are differences between, especially with settler colonies and non-settler colonies. So I think you'd find certain attitude become more entrenched within colonies where there was actual settlement and people had sort of engagement with it, and to just go to the point that Kristen was making, I think even here there's sort of this push towards, let's have greater punishments. And in fact, the typical call is for arrest, and it's done so sort of automatically, have they arrested anybody for this or the other, without really thinking, it's almost the arrest itself is portrayed as part of the punishment,
Okay.
And it's all the whole idea that detention, is this sort of legitimate way of jailing people. When you look at bail, most of, I think it was about 90% of guys in jail in pre-trial bail in Kenya, pre-trial jail, sorry, in Kenya, actually have been awarded bail, but it's set at such a high price that they can't afford it. So it kind of keeps being reinforced that, once you're in, you're going to stay in, and then you're going to find every bit of means. And even though our constitution sort of guarantees that you should have access to bail, in practice, it is routinely voided by these sorts of conditions. And this assumption that although we should presume you innocent, it's up to you to prove that, you're going to turn up in court. It's not up to them to show that you're the one who's going to get away, and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just add one small thing?
Please.
Sorry.
No, the floor is yours.
just to build on Patrick's point about settler colonialism, I think we definitely do see this, in places like Kenya, also South Africa as well. And one of the things that, one of the projects that I'm involved in right now is sort of a comparative study of places that were colonized by Britain on the African continent, some which were settler colonies, some which weren't. And, you do see white settlers calling for higher rates of incarceration, more violent punishment, both publicly in terms of like in state institutions, but also privately. So, we're sort of tracing some of that and thinking about, again, these legacies of anti-Blackness and punishment in settler colonial societies, but also, in other places as well. And so I think that settler presence does have a really, really big impact, definitely. So just sort of wanted to echo that point.
That makes me think of, I always remember the really quite famous quote I definitely used in my PhD thesis of the sort of settler hysteria around the Mau Mau and the to hang every Gikuyu from the tree, that being that sort of sentiment of this movement against colonialism, that being the indictment of what should happen. I think it's just really interesting, everything that we've said here about, especially Kristen, your comments about the popular demand for this as well. Even just the other day, I saw, slightly off topic in a sense, but I saw sort of like a very low minor offence being discussed on Twitter here in the UK, and made the on Facebook, made the terrible error of going on the comments and you see the comments and sort of people saying they should be locked away and the key thrown away, and you think, for this? Really? And so there is that popular discourse and demand for longer sentence, harsher sentences. It is really part of the sort of psyche for many people, which yeah, it's quite astounding to this day. I guess before I move on to open the floor for a Q&A, is there anything else you wanted to bring up at this point or discuss?
Well, I just want to mention one. This idea of let's build more prisons. I mean, it's been floated in Kenya as well. But what happens is when you build more prisons, you don't end up with more space for prisoners. You just have more prisoners. You end up jailing more people. And I think that the logic of the prison itself, is what really needs to be questioned. And people, I think, a lot of times the discourse over prison improvement, is kind of militates against people starting to think of alternatives. What else can we do? How do we actually end up with less prisons and not more? Because the idea is, just make prison humane. And I think until we actually start saying, all right, fine, that's not doable. That's been tried, it's not going to happen. So let's actually talk about getting rid of prisons and start thinking about what comes after.
Yeah, just one point that I wanted to add in terms of, changing attitudes and this penal populism that Kristen mentioned. One thing that was really interesting during the sort of height of the COVID-19 pandemic is that all around the world, including in Kenya, including in Uganda, South Africa, the UK, although the UK not to a very great extent, to be honest, is prisoners were given early release, right? So there was this concern, obviously, that prisons are a space where there's a lot of risk for COVID-19, right. And over 1 million prisoners were released around the world, just like that. People were being freed, often people who, were particularly vulnerable, in terms of their health, but also people who had been, committed for short-term offenses who are at the end of their sentences. And obviously this is a really recent phenomenon, but there's been some really good research to show that in places, there's been some work on the US, for example, to show that suddenly when all these people were released, crime rates weren't going up, things weren't getting worse, public safety wasn't getting worse. So if we can release 1 million prisoners sort of in the span of a few months, a year, and things are fine, then why are we putting more and more people into prison, right? And I think we can kind of unpack that phenomenon more to kind of challenge some of these perceptions around how we're dealing, how we're using sort of incarceration so broadly, and instead think about decarceration, which was what was happening. And a lot of abolitionist activists and activists in prison have pointed to this, if we can release all these people, and things are fine, then why aren't we just releasing more people in general? So I think that's been a really interesting thing to reflect on in the last few years, for sure.
Although one could say that they were being released into a wider prison because we are all kind of locked up in our own houses.
Yeah, for sure.
But I get the point. Yeah, you're really right. Yeah.
And the problem was too that people weren't being given proper supports after they were released. So this wasn't a perfect solution, but it was something that was kind of historically unprecedented. So it kind of gives us pause to think, right? Yeah, for sure.
Right. Yeah.
For sure.
Kristen, did you want to come in there at all, or just like open?
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's a good point, because I was actually just before getting on to the presentation, I was actually making a submission to the Portfolio Committee on Correctional Services, because they took the point, COVID obviously was an unprecedented time, and they themselves realized that while we're having these people incarcerated for these really minor offenses, or people, and by the way, we actually made lockdown very punitive, and those who were arrested and detained for being violating lockdown rules actually received a criminal record, and oops, we shouldn't have done that actually. And so part of the bill that the government has now introduced is to actually expunge the criminal records of people who were arrested for COVID-19 related offences, but also to deal with minor offences where people actually paid admission of guilt fines, and to expunge those records, and then also to give the minister the discretion to issue rules or a list of offences that will not be subjected to criminalisation. So people will not be getting, will not be arrested, detained, or formally charged for those offences. So it definitely, advocacy in this regard definitely paved the way for successful reform. And I mean, definitely we could take the abolition route by, just at least illustrating that, by focusing on alternatives and making sure that we emphasize that confinement should be the last resort, could be the move and the shift towards the alternative. And then also making the point that Katherine mentioned, the COVID-19, how that, unfolded, that could also be a greater need to emphasize that confinement should not, incarceration is not the only solution to dealing with problematic behavior or offending behavior. And it should be there for the last resort, at least.
Yeah, I mean, the absurdity of arresting people for COVID-related offenses when you're trying to decongest spaces and then you put them all in jail. We saw it here, it made absolutely no sense. But anyway, yeah, no, you're very right.
I'm looking at the incarceration of COVID offences in the country I'm currently sitting in, hosting this webinar from. It's very interesting to see members of our parliament not being arrested.
Right.
That's a whole another layer there.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, it's for particular people, that's what prisons are. In Kenya, prisons are for the poor. You're wealthy, even if you're convicted of an offense, you very quickly develop some mysterious illness that requires you to be incarcerated in the private wing of a hospital, that stuff.
Yeah.
It's only the poor who actually go to prison, to be honest.
So many layers, sis. Well, thank you all so much. That was, so much to unpack there. And I think so much that it's given me to think about. I know the NBC team when we move forward with this project, and everyone in the audience. Thank you to everyone that's already been putting things in the comments. While I'm sort of working my way through this, I can see that Anthony has his hand raised. Anthony, would you like to come in first and ask your question?
Thank you. I was aware that we can't be more controversial than this, so I'll be very controversial. I'll send this message to Patrick because he might be able to understand what I'm talking about. When we got independence after the British, 1963, we retained the district officers, we retained the provincial commissioners, and we retained permanent secretaries, So the government was formed of people who were trained in, well, I can't say they went to England, but some of the police superintendents, most of the inspectors were white, But we had people who, up to now, we know their names. I can say Mahihu was part of the Manyani wardens. He became a provincial commissioner. Cheluget, he was a prison warden. He became a provincial commissioner. District officers, we retained them. And these are the guys who actually took over the land from the freedom fighters. We know their names. They're untouchables in Kenya. If you talk about them, you're either killed or life in Kenya is so cheap. How do we decolonize or make abolition when these are the people who, it's their parents, their grandchildren are now actually the richest people in Kenya? They're the ones who are controlling the country. They're behind the scene, people like Uhuru Kenyatta's brother, Muhoho. Nobody talks about him because Mama Ngina, nobody talks about her, So there are people who actually control the country in a way that we see all these puppets, talking, but there are people who don't talk anything. So it's not a question, but I'm thinking, why don't we touch such issues? Why are we not talking about neo-colonialism or the British involvement in East African industries, where they had all this, monopoly for 20, 30 years before, after independence?
Okay. You want to take a few questions, or do you want me to respond? Beth.
Maybe if we respond to this one, and then I'll take the next 3 questions in a row, if that's all right.
Okay. Well, my first reaction is that there would be no need to decolonize if there wasn't a colonial system. The reason why we still have to do this work is because those people stayed, because the system was maintained, and the people who were invested in keeping it going, essentially, were the people who took power. And they've maintained it. I think 2010 was kind of the first step in trying to overthrow at least the colonial structure itself. But the mentalities that were built up through the colonial system still stay here. And I think part of the reason why the sorts of things Kalume is speaking about are not discussed openly is essentially because we've never done the work of mental decolonization, of actually getting people to think differently, than how we were sort of conditioned to see the world by colonialism. And I think that's where the work we will have to start. We'll have to start with education, with questioning people's basic understanding of the world around them.
Thank you ever so much for that question, Anthony. So I've been writing a list to make sure I'm trying not to miss anyone and trying to keep it in the order of where people appear. So I can see there's a question from Lennon in the comment box. Did you want to turn on your microphone and ask that question, or would you like me to ask it on your behalf, Lennon? I'm happy either way. But we'll go to Lennon, then Linda, and then Nora, if that's okay. Please ask. Perfect, Lennon. Okay, let me make sure I represent it correctly. Okay, so Lennon's interested in how these precise punitive and carceral orientations remain pervasive in the present, particularly as technologies of anti-Blackness across geographies, in addition to African context, so that the colonial is not merely in the past, but an enduring condition across the so-called West. As is the case with police violence, I'm wondering what the relationship of these practices of detention to other legal infrastructures of extraction would be. I'm thinking here, for instance, of laws such as the Witchcraft Suppression Act in Zimbabwe, settler Rhodesia, together with tax, mining, and other laws regulating the human animal otherworld. Would anyone like to come in on? Oh no, I'll ask that one and then I'll go to Linda and then Nora. So Linda asks, has there been any change in the way prisons are operated in Kenya after the 2010 constitution, which now calls them correctional facilities? So has there been any notable change there? And then Nora, I can see your hand raised. Would you like to ask your question?
Sure, I can ask my question. Thank you for organizing this interesting conversation. I guess I wonder if we are missing part of an important part of this conversation being one of British ideas of space and spatialization, and juxtaposing that against African ideas of space and spatialization, so that for the British, confinement becomes an important way of demonstrating power in a way that is not important for Africans, right? And so I wonder if in anyone's research, anyone on the panel, where if that has been an important kind of point of consideration for you. And then as we talk about alternatives or imagining alternatives, African societies did have ways of dealing with social transgressions. Like this, it's just that we did not confine people who transgress socially, right? And so maybe when we think about imagining alternatives, it may not be a need to reimagine, but to reapply modes of previously used rehabilitate. I don't know what the correct word is, but the ways that we attended to social transgressions may be how we need to rethink the ways that you know, we should be thinking about abolition moving forward.
Two fantastic questions, Nora. I'm really interested in this idea of spatialization of power, and yeah, you're really at the heart of sort of decentering Eurocentric models of punishment, I guess. So yeah, I'll open for those three questions, well, multiple questions to the panelists.
I'll let you guys go first because I spoke last. Or should I just go? Go ahead, Catherine.
Whatever you want. These are such great questions, and I'm sure I won't do them all justice. So I'm just going to share some initial reflections, and then with the other panelists, I'm sure they'll have lots else to say. I think, thank you all for these questions. I think, like Beth just said, Nora, in response to your question, there is this disconnect between conceptions of space and how space is used, and confinement, you know, being quite specific to the sort of European punitive imaginary. And I think that there's a lot more work and research that can be done on these longer histories of different types of justice and these systems that are more restorative, you know, and Patrick mentioned this at the very beginning, right? More restorative justice practices that take a more community-centered approach. And we see this, you know, this long history existing on the African continent and in other places in the world. You know, there's discussions about that with Indigenous communities here in Canada. One of the challenges is that colonial officials tried to just completely be so critical of earlier justice systems in trying to justify the introduction of prisons. And I think this is where oral histories become really important, because a lot of the written record is just colonial officials saying, oh, this was such a bad system, everything that happened before was so bad, and, you know, quote unquote backwards, for example. And so I think there's a lot, there's these practices exist and these histories exist, and I think they're not always as visible, and they've been sort of, the colonial state has sort of tried to erase them. And so I think there's a lot of work that that we can do there. And I think as well, in terms of thinking about space and prisons, this is maybe a slightly different point, but prisons were also took up a lot of land, right? And I remember when I was doing research on Uganda, you have no prisons in the 1890s, or the first prisons are built. And then by the 1960s, you see like a map just absolutely filled with prisons, and the colonial state and then the post-colonial state is buying up more and more and more land to use for things like prison farming. And like, who was on that land before? How was that land being used? And so I think prisons as landholders and taking over space is also something that could be sort of unpacked more. So yeah, absolutely, you know, agree with that point. And I think it's important when we think about abolition to also think about what came before colonialism, and to try and continue to learn more about that. Yeah, those are my initial thoughts. I know that's just one question, but I'll keep thinking about the others.
Okay, so I'll go next, and I'll touch on the idea of, you know, the need to look at alternatives, or look at perhaps the pre-colonial past for ideas on how we can deal with crime. And back then, back in the day, criminal justice systems were more focused on restitution and reconciliation rather than punishment. And this is also largely what the campaign to decriminalize poverty and status also calls for. And also pre-colonial past were more victim-centered rather than perpetrator-centered. And I do definitely think there could be a move towards, the non-custodial way of dealing with offences or crimes, especially for non-violent crimes. But also, right. Sorry, if I might just make the point that if we do look at that, we need to just always make sure that it is still within the boundaries of the Constitution. Because if I look at, for example, in South Africa, we have the traditional tribunals bill where within certain rural areas, certain tribes still there's a bill where certain tribes want to control, the crime of certain offending behavior. It's been very controversial and there's always been, the move to not allow to go through because it doesn't uphold the Constitution and the rights of people and so forth. So it's always important to ensure that, when we do consider that we look at it in the broader sense and that there is public consultation in the way in which that process unfolds.
Okay. I'll have to log off after I just make my comment because, as I mentioned before, I've got a meeting at 4:30. But I think first, on the effect of the new constitution, and it's Linda's question. The fact is, there's been lots of talk, very little action, and actually, to be honest, the talk of reforming and improving the prison system predated the new constitution. So if you think during Mwai Kibaki's time, you had the vice president then, Mudiawari, sort of making it a big pillar of his efforts, putting TVs in common rooms in prisons, and stuff like that. But it was more about improvement, not really about abolishing it, and it never really, in essence, was effected. Prison life remains pretty brutal until today. With regard to, I completely agree with Nora's point about that this is not necessarily imagining new ways of dealing with crime, and a lot of it is really remembering what was done before. But the problem we have there is lots, I think even Katherine mentioned this, that lots of how we are taught to think about that past, the pre-colonial past, is basically Hobbesian, is very brutal, nasty, short, and people are presented as if, they want real societies, the functioning societies, the real sort of the money, whatever, natural man, if you will, just ambling about and making it up as he goes. And that punishment was basically stoning, killing people, beheading, cutting off hands, that sort of thing. It's very hard to get people to imagine this as societies that operated and that innovated, that thought of crime as something, that had theories about how you deal with crime, and you find this actually, just to draw a quick aside, even in the way we look at whatever the independence movements. If we look at the Mau Mau, there's very little discussion about the ideology of the Mau Mau. What were the politics of the Mau Mau? What were they? How did they think society should be run? They're only presented as people who went into the forest to fight, and all they wanted were these tangible things, land and stuff, but never really thought about, quote unquote higher things about how societies should be run. I think we are taught to discard what was past, and not to imagine that there's any value there. And that is one of the big legacies, really painful legacies of colonialism. Lastly, to it's Lemon, I think, Lennon's question. I think when he asked about the relationship of Castro practices to the rest of colonialism, it was absolutely fundamental to it. It was one of the ways in which the whole mechanism of extraction was made possible. Firstly, and I think Katherine made a really good, really explained it well. Firstly, through the control that was exercised by the threat of imprisonment and the punishment that happens there, but also through prisons being ways to mobilize labor, and extract that labor. So yeah, without prisons, I don't think they have gotten as far with colonization and colonial extraction as they did. That said, I've really got to run. So thanks a lot for having me. Really appreciate it, the opportunity, and I'll be in touch.
Thanks so much, Patrick. Take good care.
Okay, bye.
Thanks, Patrick.
Perfect. Well, I would say we've got about 2 minutes before I draw us to a close. So I'm just going to quickly go to Neil's question in the chat and then come to Chandini. Neil's lovely to have you in the chat. I was reading your new article that came out on Mau Mau in the museums. So for anyone interested in reading, please go check it out. So Neil says, wonderful discussion. Thank you all. Speakers have rightfully pointed out that there has been no rehabilitation in Africa penal systems, either colonially or in the period since. Maybe the speakers could disentangle what rehabilitation means in the context of oppressive and unequal societies. Doesn't that concept rely on a colonial logic as well, i.e. labelling political or socio-economic protest as crime and then seeking to neutralise it through rehabilitation, as was the purpose of the Mau Mau era rehabilitation? So the problem is then maybe not the prison, but the society in which prisoners are rehabilitated. A really important point. Katherine or Kristen, did you want to expand on that now, or shall I go to Chandini?
No, I think you can go on to the next question.
Yeah. Chandini, do you want to jump in?
So thank you so much for this very enlightening and very thought-provoking talk. I know as organizers, we don't really ask questions, but I couldn't stop myself and to ask a question here. So as a citizen of a former British colony myself, I'm an Indian, I realized that for most colonies, our current day systems of political systems are inspired from the West, actually the Britain. So when we say that we want to decolonize our systems, does that mean that we go back to the pre-colonial systems of governance? Wouldn't that be more alien for modern day Kenyans, modern day Indians, modern day South Africans than their pre-colonial structures, because we've lived with the colonial structures for so long? So if you could give, I don't understand this debate of decolonization. So if you could please explain that to me as a teacher.
Thank you, Chandini. Yeah, Katherine, Kristen, we've got a couple of minutes, so we unfortunately, Chandini, we won't be able to explain the whole sort of ideology around this, I guess. But if Katherine or Kristen would like to offer any feedback, that'd be great.
I think maybe Katherine or maybe you, Beth, if you could speak to the decolonization issue. But I'd like to speak to, I think, Neil, who made the point, and I agree, I partly agree with him. I think the problem is, it is partly the prison, but it's also the society into which prisons are rehabilitated. So it's a combination of both. And it really depends on the history of a particular country. And I mean, so if you look at South Africans and where they come from, you know, the dehumanization and the racial segregation and inferiority that they were subject to in terms of education and access to opportunities. A lot of the people that are incarcerated, are vulnerable, poor Black people, or who are descendants of that generation. And so therefore it requires a different social construct in order to empower and educate them within a system, unfortunately, which is based on from a physical point, built on a colonial detention system that is based on purely punishment, and therefore it's not possible to fulfill the rehabilitative notion or model. And then also unfortunately the society that they come from, they go back into the societies where crime is rife, where poverty is huge. There's not enough opportunities for them in terms of job opportunities, economic opportunities, educational. The system inside the detention centers did not provide them enough tools to equip them. So definitely it is a combination of both.
Thank you so much, Kristen.
These are such great questions, and I'll try to just very briefly touch on these really important points that both of you have made. So thank you, and Kristen's points as well are fantastic. So in terms of this idea of rehabilitation, I think that that's such a key point. And Beth and I have done some work on this, but just to give a really specific example, like in Kenya in the 1950s, for women who were being detained, we can kind of take an intersectional approach, right? Think about race and gender, for example. Being rehabilitated meant to become sort of, to have this sort of, there was this domestic feminine image that the British had that was very much tied to British ideals of domesticity and femininity, and to be rehabilitated meant to sort of conform to that ideal, right? And just more broadly speaking, being rehabilitated in a colonial context means not being disruptive, not disrupting the economic order, the political order, the social order, right? So I think it's really important to just question, like, what is the endpoint of that rehabilitation? And I think for the question around decolonization, I really like what Nora just put in the chat, right? Thinking of pre-colonial societies as, just to say what Nora said, thinking about drawing inspiration from. And this question of decolonization is so complicated, right? We can think about it as an event, not as an event, not just like the raising of a flag and independence, but as this process. And, Patrick spoke a lot about like decolonization of the mind, for example. So there's different levels to this. But I think, recognizing, as we've done in this discussion, talked about these colonial afterlives, these colonial legacies that persist, recognizing them, sort of pushing back against them and thinking, okay, what can be done differently? And maybe that is looking back at restorative justice models that existed previously and thinking about how that might make sense. And maybe it's other things as well, right? And this gets complicated in an African context where we still have colonial borders, right? So I don't think we can just say, oh, we'll just go back. But thinking about what, like Nora said, inspiration can be drawn from those earlier histories, and then actively sort of acknowledging and pushing back against the infrastructures and ideologies of colonialism that still persist. So it's not a very concrete answer, but it's a really good question to continue to think about, I think. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I can see the time is 1:30 now, and we've taken up a lot of time from our speakers already. I just want to thank you for your such fantastic insights, for sparking this conversation, generating these questions. This isn't a conversation NBC is going to end at this point. We're continuing with this work, and you'll be seeing a lot more coming up in the coming months around this topic. So if anyone wants to get involved in any way, has any ideas of that sort, we're always open ears via our social media. I just want to also say a final thanks to Chandini for organising all the tech side of things. Thank you for doing that. I could not have done that whilst also keeping my eyes on the chat box. And just a final reminder that for those who are already aware of the Museum of British Colonialism, if you're not, we're fully volunteer run. We're just doing our best in terms of exploring these histories, disseminating these histories as widely as possible. So your support for our work is always really, really appreciated. So please do go check out the website, our socials, and we look forward to inviting you back for another event soon. But thank you again, Katherine, Kristen and Patrick, who's had to rush off. But I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day, whatever time zone they are in. And I will speak to you all soon and hopefully see more of you at our next event.
Thanks, everyone.